Nothing had been discussed. I just assumed I would be naked. I got undressed and asked him what he would like me to do. He said it was up to me. I lay down on the sofa and shielded my eyes, the big ceiling lights in the studio working on full power. I lay down, but I didn't want to look obedient in my portrait. I didn't feel obedient. I wanted my father to paint me, but not like the others. There was some kind of battle going on, unacknowledged, but expressed in the muscles of my bent leg. I was alert, prepared to spring up at any moment. I asked him not to paint in my hairy legs. He said it wasn't like that. We talked about makeup. He didn't like to paint it, but I was not going to take off my mascara. In the end, he decided it was part of me. That was a small victory. I wanted to know if he was happy with the pose. He thought it was spectacular, but showed some concern. I'm not sure whether he was worried about my ability to keep going until the end of the painting with so much tension in my body, or if he was uneasy about the level of exposure I'd unwittingly chosen to inflict on myself. I was unaware of how much he could see from his vantage point. I think I understand now he wanted my permission to use what he could see, to shift the responsibility onto me and take advantage of my generosity, even if I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know what he was asking for. I was shocked when I looked at the canvas and saw what he saw. This was a night picture. I sat 3 or 4 times a week, starting when it got dark, often until dawn. We were collaborators, but he always wanted to work way longer than I wanted to work. I didn't know how to make him stop, how to stick up for myself. He groaned in disappointment if I needed a stretch or to go to the bathroom. The urgency of his resolve, a trial of my courage. After a long session, I didn't always go home. I slept in the studio if I was aching, wide awake but too tired to get up off the sofa. He chucked a blanket over me and gave me a big glass of port to knock me out, for which I was grateful. I started at Central School of Art a few months into the painting on the foundation course, and after a couple of hours I would have to get up and go in. Sometimes he offered me one of the little blue pills that he kept in his bathroom cupboard next to the bottle of Mandrax, prescription drugs he obtained from his doctor to help him work harder and unwind at bedtime if he was too wired to stop. He told me the blue ones were called Purple Hearts and that they had been used by fighter pilots during the war to keep going on overnight missions, associating himself in my mind with those heroes who dropped bombs on Nazi Germany, the home from which he had fled with his family when he was 9. He worked heroically, and I wanted to be like him. The pills woke me up and ruined my appetite. I went to art school in his shirts, his old jackets. It upset me when the picture went badly and he stabbed himself in the leg with the end of his paintbrush. I just had to lie there while he shouted and hurt himself. When it went well, he conjured a marvelous excitement under the bright lights, all the stories he told me, his escapades with aristocrats and villains in London, of his nurse and the legendary glimpse of Hitler in Berlin before he came over, the songs he sang to keep me entertained. He knew by heart Hilaire Belloc's cautionary tales, Prufrock and Shakespeare's best sonnet, My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. A poem he recited so many times it stuck in my head and is still there to sustain me when I need to sleep and I can't sleep. I never got tired of listening to it, even the times he rewrote the last couplet off the top of his head for his own reasons, without even knowing it. I shared his pleasure in the celebration of the unpoetical attributes of the beloved mistress, even as I cringed in mild embarrassment. She was so rough and yet so adored. Although there was a poem he recited once too often, as I lay there with my eyes half hidden under his scrutiny, by the Earl of Rochester, called Written Under Nellie's Picture, about Nell Gwynn. It went something like this. She was so exquisite a whore that in the belly of her mother she placed her cunt so right before her father fucked them both together. He loved Flaubert above all other writers and was drawn to his letters in particular, as well as the letters and diaries of Kafka, the stories of Maupassant, Prufrock and other Eliot poems, Nietzsche after Francis Bacon, and the Edward Muybridge books of photographs, another enthusiasm that came through Francis. He told me that there were absolutes in art, nothing was relative, and loathed the idea of self-expression. He referred to Sigmund as my grandfather and knew some of the jokes out of jokes and their relation to the unconscious, but was not himself conscious of Freud's theory about Oedipus. He thought a person ought to be medically trained to perform psychoanalysis, that it took no heed of the lifespan, and was shameful if you found yourself on the receiving end of it. I used to leave the studio after work and descend the stairs with so much stuff buzzing in my head I could hardly contain myself. I've forgotten any confusion or upset I might have experienced. As I remember my descent, I was always elated, senses heightened, ready to take on anything under his influence. The studio on the 5th floor of a converted house in Holland Park felt almost too private, the unusual arrangement of the doors into the flat adding to the sense of a closed world. The doors, 2 featureless panels of wood covered in fawn-coloured baize, were hung back to back in the doorway at the top of the communal staircase and hinged at opposite sides of the opening, a defensive system designed by my father to double his privacy and keep himself safe, the muffled panels pressed together when locked, no more than the thickness of a sheet of paper between them. Often I had the feeling I just missed somebody as I arrived, or that another person would turn up on my departure. The day models and night models scheduled not to cross over because everything was secret and everybody must be kept apart. Sometimes there were clues, an unfamiliar blouse over the back of the bathroom chair, a cigarette stubbed out on a plate in the kitchen. Once the doors were locked, nobody could get in. Nobody had a spare key. I rather wished somebody might bang on the outer door during a sitting just to stir things up and relieve the tension. When Haagen-Dazs first arrived in the shops from America, he loved the strawberry flavour and used to stand by the freezer in the kitchen, spoon in hand, digging the ice cream out of the pint carton like a teenager. At work, his concentration was complete. I had the luxury and pain of his full attention in the studio, but suddenly he would break off in the middle of a brushstroke, leave me on my own, and go into the boiler room to make a personal phone call or place a bet. Urgent activities that seemed to pull him away from the painting in the same way as the ice cream, wasting his time and my own. One evening when I was not sitting, I went back to North London to visit my mum. I owed her money for some reason, I can't remember exactly, and as I had no cash on me, I wrote her a cheque, perhaps hoping she might not cash it, debt cancelled, the ordinary thoughts of a teenager, reluctant to pay what was owed to a parent. I handed it over, and she examined it forensically, her slow smile betraying grief and inflicting it. She claimed to be astonished by the signature. My bank account was in the name of Rose Boyt, but my mum said she thought I called myself Freud now, since I lived near my dad and had gone over to his side. I tried to reassure her, offering comfort even though I felt hurt by her accusation, but she wouldn't give it up. Although she knew she was wrong, she said she really believed I called myself Freud and held on to her grievance no matter what I said to convince her, nursing the wound and reluctant to relinquish it. On my birth certificate, I have no surname at all, although both my parents are named, each registered at a different address. My father at 20 Delamere Terrace, Paddington, and my mum at 357 Liverpool Road, a house in Islington that belonged to an actor called Norman Bowler, once married to Henrietta Moraes, who sat not only for my father but also for Francis. The house was full already, no spare bedrooms, but Norman was kind enough to put us up anyway. My mum on the floor of the sitting room with my brother Alexander tucked in beside her until I came along and he had to move over. He was her first child, later known as Ali, not much more than 18 months old when I was born, still small enough to ride in our pram. In my earliest memory, we are parked out front in the pram to get some fresh air and look after ourselves for a while. I'm propped up at the foot end under a thick grey blanket to keep warm, and he's sitting in shadow under the grey braided fringe of the hood, wearing some kind of leather safety harness to restrain him in case he tried to climb out. Peace and quiet for Mum, who was upstairs. I hope she was painting. She was a wonderful painter and believed in the importance of painting, but not with such fierce zeal as my father, for whom it mattered beyond anything. When life got too hard for her to go on with that type of work, she made other things, numberless manifestations of her creativity she didn't value highly enough. Everything domestic and not attracting much acclaim, nobody sacrificed in the process. The thought she was making art never occurring to her or anybody else at the time. We attended the register office on the 8th of January, better late than never, a good 7 weeks after my birth. Dad accompanied us, or met us there, a family outing, but Mum must have been too diffident and grand to insist on helping herself to his name on my behalf, let alone for her own sake. That was her style, her personality, no slight whatsoever implied towards anybody who might have been less backward at coming forward in the same circumstances. My guess is that Mum sensed she would do better not to claim anything from him. She wished to behave without rapaciousness and avoid any awkward scenes, always super cool when he was around and hiding her feelings because she didn't want to make him feel tied down. Everything was so precarious. But who knows what was really going on?
Thank you, Rose. And so we begin really with our exploration of your life as it's laid out and your world in this in Naked Portraits, which many of you probably not read yet, but can very soon. And I really enjoyed reading that opening passage. There's so much going on there. Straight away, with your father's world and what's going on there, and then we hear about your mother as well and what's going on there, and we've got these two completely different situations going on which coalesce and come back together again at various times without spoiling anything too much for anyone that hasn't read it. What was it about this particular moment in time that made you think, I want to get all of this down and to publish Naked Portrait?
Two things really. One was finding a diary that I'd made when I was sitting for a portrait, not this one when I was a teenager, but one that I was sitting in 1989, 1990, and I found the diary in a cardboard box. It was literally that many typed pages, and I suddenly thought, oh, I wrote that diary. And then I started looking through it, and it had all his stories in it, and I felt that I would maybe write a mild book about his stories and immortalize all those incredible things that he told me when I was sitting. But I wasn't at all ready at that moment to read the diary because my mum had died really recently, my dad was dead, and I was having to move out of my house because it had to have structural work done. And I just thought, I felt completely destabilized in all directions, and the last thing I wanted to do was to open this diary and see what had really happened or what hadn't really happened. And I had an idea that the diary was, what was interesting about it was his stories. And then then I'd shown some photographs of him in his studio that I took when I was at the time of that sitting for that painting that I was just talking about just now. And I'd written an essay for the catalogue, and that was the first thing I'd really written, having written various novels, most of which were completely ignored. I got so many people saying to me that really spoke to me, that the essay that I wrote in the catalogue. So I started thinking, I've got this essay, and then I've got this diary, and just the feeling, my loathing of the idea of going back, and my loathing of the idea of trying to work out what I really felt, or what he really meant to me. The whole thing just seemed like, I couldn't do that. And so then I started thinking, I could just write his stories. And then after we moved back into the house and I felt I'd recovered a bit more from my mum dying, I opened the diary and I started thinking, I'll just type this up, this thing. So I started having a look at it. And after I think the first page that I typed up, I felt like I needed to have an argument with it, because I was just thinking, what is this preposterous thing? And so then I suddenly thought, I'll have two typefaces, one for the diary and one for the argument. And then I thought, and I can use that thing, the ideas from the Ordovas catalogue, which was about sitting for the portrait when I was a teenager. And then the whole thing turned into me discovering everything that I was amazed to discover about what had happened, and then also more disconcerting, discovering everything that I knew had happened that wasn't in the diary. So obviously when I was doing the diary, I wasn't thinking, I'm doing this for posterity or publication. I was just writing any old thing just as a way of that feeling of loss that you have when you forget things was something that was so big in my mind that I just felt like I didn't want to lose everything. But I hadn't really thought, am I a good writer, or is this a load of nonsense, or anything? And I also censored it so heavily, even though I had no idea that anyone was ever going to read it. And so when I started typing it up, there were some bits that I just thought, I'm not typing that. That just felt like completely all manner of wrong. And then I started this, not exactly a dialogue, but in my actual real-time responses. So I'd be typing it, and then I'd suddenly think, no, that's not what happened. And then I was able to write what really happened. And then I became, as the book progressed, I learnt more about myself. And then I had to go back to the earlier bits and think, no, that wasn't what happened. So then I had to have an argument with the retrospective narrative as well as the diary. And so that everything was just up completely. It reminded me of being when I was 14, and I remember thinking every day, you were such an idiot yesterday, now you know everything. And I've had that same sort of feeling of thinking that I'd had these epiphanies when I really understood, and then 2 days later I think, no, that was all wrong. And then after a while, rather than throwing away everything that was wrong, I more wrote into it and thought, just thinking about the ambiguity was something I realized was a precious thing, and that I didn't really want to come up with an answer at the end. I loved him, I hated him, I felt this, I felt that. I just thought it can all be in there and see what happens.
So you weren't even thinking, well, this could be a biography, this could be a memoir. You were simply doing that for your own purposes at first.
No, I did think I need to tell my story, I think. I didn't realize that I was going to tell the story I told. I thought I was going to tell a mild book about sitting, was how I felt about it. And then the more engaged and also enraged I became, the less mild it became. And then I realized I had something quite different on my hands, you know.
Yeah. And the painting that you refer to is Rose. It's called Rose. A title that you gave the painting.
Yes, it was going to be called The Painter's Daughter, which I didn't feel great about, and it was also for obvious reasons. And so, so I thought it should be called Rose, and I also was writing a novel at the time of doing that painting, which I also called Rose. And in the novel, I was me. And even though it was a character called Rose, who was a character, and it wasn't all true, but it was still me working out who I was. And then in the painting, obviously, in a painting, you're the version of yourself that has been seen through somebody else's eyes. And so it is and isn't you. It's, in a way, it's maybe who they want you to be, rather than maybe necessarily who you really are.
Well, that's interesting again, because you talk in the book about this idea of collaboration, the sitter and the artist, and that comes up, in different ways as well, in terms of, is it a collaboration, or was this all my own work, and these kind of phrases. But actually, I mean, they were grueling sessions, weren't they? These weren't this wasn't done in a day. This was an enormously... It
was an enormous commitment and very, very physically grueling, and also obviously mentally and emotionally grueling in terms of, what do you do with the contents of your head? It's not that you can get your phone out and check it. You're lying there and you can't move. You've consented to lying there with nothing on and not being able to move. But the process of it is, it can go on and on and on all night, and you lose all feeling in your hand, legs, heart, brain. You end up, it's quite transformative, not necessarily in a good way.
Yeah. Well, as you say at one point, the summer wasn't so bad because, it's light at 4:30 and it's not dark until after 10. But the winter sounded like they were very long sessions.
Yeah, it was long. It was tough.
And the breaks seem to also have been only punctuated when Lucien wanted to go and make a phone call or to go out to do something or needed a break. But actually, you took opportunity in those moments, didn't you, to also use it as a way of getting down some of this?
Yes, and that was the in a way that he was immortalizing me in oils, and I was also sneakily writing down everything interesting that he said. And I had the skirt I was wearing had big pockets that you couldn't see because they were inside the pleats, and I had a piece of paper all folded up tiny and a little one of those betting shop pens. And then every time I went in the bathroom, I wrote down of exactly what he'd said, so that I was then able to type it up, but not in that sitting, not in the teenager one. That one I didn't write anything down, but I think it was very vivid, and my memories of it are very vivid. But in the one, 1989-90, I did feel that I just couldn't let it go. That at that point, the entertainment level of the stories that he told me in my mind was very, very high. And then obviously when I then started reading the diary, and I didn't say that, I didn't feel that anymore. And as I say in the book, I felt like I should have said to him, Dad, just shut the fuck up, rather than just listening to more and more transgressive. See, this is going to make you want to buy the book because it's full of transgressive stories. But looking at it, it was really painful to see that, that my daughterhood was disrespected to the level where he just didn't have the idea that I might not want to hear about him going to the VD clinic or, But I did survive.
Well, and also, through all of the portraits, of course, your life's moving on and in a really different space than when you enter the studio and you're having that painting done. And that was such a fascinating thing to read about, because in my mind, you start mentioning, some of the clubs that you worked in and set up and the warehouse parties that you were organising. And in my mind, those things were very different parts of British culture at the time. I didn't necessarily associate warehouse parties with Lucien Freud. They were completely different cultural ends of the spectrum. And yet for you, they were just a day. That could happen, within the space of a few hours, because it's your life and this is what you were doing. Did it? And also, I think the power in which you went about those things and your friends, so we're talking about sort of a punk era, very short hair, spiky haircuts, all kinds of different things going on in terms of fashion, all kinds of different attitudes changing in Britain generationally. And And I was really interested in that in terms of how that would be regarded by your father and by Francis Bacon and other people around on the scene. Were they interested in all of that side of things? Were they interested in punk and what was going on at the time?
I certainly remember when I had my Saturday job in Seditionaries, which was a punk, for those of you who are under the age of my age, was a punk shop in King's Road that was run by Vivian Westwood and Malcolm McLaren. And they had trousers called bondage trousers. I don't know whether anyone knows them. And basically your legs are tied together so you can't really walk properly. And zips up the back. And I remember going to meet my dad and Francis being there, and then both of them sort of agreed that the trousers were basically ridiculous, but they looked brilliant on me. Like, no one else could get away with this. I was like, everyone's getting away with it. But yeah, and I think that because my father wanted me to be strong, and then because I had short spiky hair and I had bondage trousers and I was doing all sorts, involved in different things, I think it made him feel less anxious about me, and I think that suited him because he wanted me to be. He used to say to me when I was a teenager, "You're such a strong person. You're so strong." And I remember thinking, "Yeah, but why do I feel so weak then?" Rather than thinking, "Dad, I'm not strong," because he was my dad, and I slightly worshipped him at the time. I believed it must be true, and so it puzzled me. Rather than thinking, I have my own feelings, I know who I am, I didn't know who I was, and I just went along with it. And I think because of being, not in a gang, but there were quite a few of us, girls, young women, who dressed like that and were out and about, and I think that he liked the feeling that I wasn't sitting in a corner somewhere feeling really depressed because he was rubbish.
Yeah.
Not that he was rubbish, obviously, but,
But that's such a great thing, I think, as well, that comes across. And even if you didn't know it at the time, he's obviously got this great admiration and, an interest in everything you're doing, thinking, that's great, that's amazing, it's full of energy, and you're thinking something similar, about his work and what he's doing, these genius paintings, effectively. Well, I really like it as well that you were like, I'm going to clean your studio. I'm going to come in here and do that. And the opportunity that then afforded with seeing things that might have been kept secret or you'd never have seen.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that part of me wanted to be a lovable person who could cook well and knew how to do ironing and cleaning the studio. And the other part of me was just, fuck you. And I think I had that ambiguity in myself, and so I was experimenting with the different ways of being a woman at that time, or even a teenager at that time. But I think that that was quite experimental, trying to work out who you are and what can suit you, and how obedient or disobedient it's possible to be and still remain in the family, for example.
I found that interesting, though, because, as you said in the reading, day sitters and night sitters wouldn't meet. Secrecy was everything. No one would really know what else was going on at the same time. And so in one way, doing those things was all of those things that you just described. It could be seen as obedient and loving and caring, and I'll do this for you. But at the same time, you had to be so careful because, of dust in the air and, making sure that the paintings were never spoilt or blemished. And you were getting to see all the things. So secretly, there was also this, I can look at all of the work in progress and know exactly what's going on.
If I'd wanted to.
Yeah. Did you take that opportunity?
I didn't spy on anything. No, I didn't do that. I was, there was a lot of information and things lying around, but I prided myself on just not being a nosy Parker. That was okay.
Yeah, for him to be able to do that and to have that privacy and to respect it.
Yeah, I mean, we used to sit sometimes over the two chairs with a big rubbish bin between us, and he'd just pull out all these boxes and drawers full of paperwork and letters and things, and we'd just go through it, tearing stuff up and putting it in the bin and getting rid of it. And he was aware that he didn't want to just let it all silt up and have all this stuff, and he trusted me enough to know that I could tear up a letter without, really?
Yeah.
But there was definitely a feeling of secrecy about everything, and certainly up until this moment of writing this book, I have been extremely quiet on the subject of my relationship with my father, and it does feel extremely transgressive to suddenly say, you might be turning in your grave, but I'm doing this, and it's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
Well, it's very loving, but it's a very loving book. Though.
Yeah,
I think
it is.
There's no question of that, and I think the way in which it moves and the things that happen, it's throughout. That feeling never leaves you as the reader. You're always very sure of that. So I think, I think it serves
Good
it
to
very
know.
well. Yeah. I was really interested in a lot of the things you were doing, though, as well. I mean, first of all, I should say, and it doesn't really spoil things too much, it should just make you want to go and have a look, that many of the chapters begin with a painting or a photograph, and the paintings are all by Lucien Freud, and they generally will give you a clue as to what's coming in the chapter that follows. And actually, the book does this repeatedly, so I think I got to the end of the second chapter and I made a note on my phone, because I was thinking about things, and tonight I'm thinking, would you ever consider publishing your diary? And then I turn the page and it's like, oh, it's the diary. There it was immediately. It's like, of course, that's what the rest of the book's going to be then. But there was no indication that for me at the beginning, I thought, oh, this is a memoir, and we're going to be treated to things that were in the diary without the diary itself. And then the narration between the diary and what came later, and then what you've just described in terms of the re-edit of that. It must have been really pleasurable to do, to be able to refine those things, but it works brilliantly. It's like a conversation with yourself at times.
Well, thank you.
And the other thing is the photographs. The photographs are spectacular. They're beautiful black and white portraits. Generally speaking, they're portraits of somebody that's in your life or follows in that chapter. And I thought it was such a clever and brilliant device. And not all of them have them, but they punctuate the book beautifully. And did you have that in mind right from the beginning? You thought, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna use those three different, the words and the paintings and the photographs.
Yes, I think that all fell into place quite early. When I was being painted when I was a teenager, I was doing a book of photographs of people in the bath because I was trying to think of a way of the photographs not being fashion-y, because at that time clothes were so incredibly significant. That wasn't just how it is now that you get a new dress or something. It really, the whole punk thing, it really meant something, or to me anyway. And I felt that if I just photographed everyone in their clothes, it would just be too fashion-y. And so I was trying to think of a way of photographing people not dressed, but not with a sexual element, so not on a bed, not kind of lying around, not being sort of subjected to that process in a way. And I suddenly thought, oh, I could do people in the bath. And so I started this, basically asking everyone that I knew, can you come? In these days, not that many people had a bath in the punk days. And so if you said, come round to my house, hot bath, I do need to take some photographs of you when you're in it. But and weirdly, loads and loads of people submitted to this process, and it wasn't at all how I felt about being painted, i.e. 10 hours later, you're still lying there. It was just a quick, easy thing. And I didn't feel, I suppose because I was a teenage girl, I didn't feel like I was doing anything to anybody particularly. And so, yes, I've got some of the, I think there are 2 in the book, aren't there, of women in the bath. But I have got, Paul Cook, the drummer of the Sex Pistols, in the bath, and the guy who played the sax in the X-Ray Specs in the bath, and and also people with their children, and lots of my brothers and sisters, and so yeah, as yet unpublished.
Yeah, but should be, I think so anyway. And the music that was going on as well, music comes across very, very strongly, and I loved it as soon as you start getting into these things, these different club nights that you're starting and you're putting on, and your friendship group that forms around that time, so interesting because there's names that people will know that went on and did all kinds of things, and others perhaps not so much. But it was a really fertile time for things going on, and you're right there at the centre of it all. I mean, you're running the club nights that people are playing at, I mean, it goes everywhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it was, if you're going to sit down and write a novel, you've got to do something to make money, and that was just a practical. In fact, what happened was two friends of mine, Sean and Bruce, who are both musicians, said, we're going to start a club. Do you want to do it with us? You can be on the door and be the organised person. Also, I had loads and loads of records. Mm-hmm. And so I did the door, and we started this club called the Hot Sty, and that my dad weirdly used to come to. And I can remember this surreal moment when, never having heard of breakdancing, all these people had come from New York. Fab Five Freddy, does that mean anything to anybody? Anyway, super famous hip-hop guy. And they all arrived at the Hot Sty and started spinning on their heads. And I was sitting there, oh, this is good. And my dad was there. And, you know, that we had, there were sort of surreal, everything, all the clubs that I did had not exactly a comedy aspect to them, but looking back on it now, nothing was very... it wasn't really about money. It was more about having a good time, even though, obviously, if it had been about money, that would have been good.
Well, you see what I mean now about worlds colliding. I never, when I opened that book, thought I'd have Lucien Freud and Fab Freddy breakdancing on, you know, spinning on his head on the same page, and there we are. You know, it happened. There's another moment where that stuck in my mind as well. It's the Millwall F division, F troop. And so you know, at this point you're putting on this is the warehouse party, isn't it?
Yeah, this is in King's Cross in a derelict railwayman's chapel, and
not the King's Cross of today.
No, it was pre-gentrification. And anyway, we were running this warehouse party in King's Cross. How we managed to get away with it, I don't know. And Sean Oliver, who was my very good friend that was part of this, had sickle cell, and he was quite a vulnerable adult. Anyway, these Millwall F Troop people came in and said, we're going to tax you 10% of the door and the bar. And I had this Adidas bag completely full of money tied around my ankle, and in front of me there was a bathtub full of ice and beers. That was the bar. And I was thinking, any minute he's going to look over and see this bag. And anyway, he started getting quite unpleasant. So, I thought he was going to do something to Sean, so I hit him. And then after that, I had to stand there thinking, in a minute he's going to hit me back. And he looked at me and he was thinking, can I hit her? Or would that be a thing? Or anyway, luckily for me, he decided not to. And then we ran this club every Saturday night. It was wild. And then these guys said they were coming back next week for their 10%. So we had to hire some people to look after us, these boys from South London, and they came, and there was a big altercation with the Millwall F squad. And what happened was that we then had to keep these South London people to come back every week, because they were saying, if we're not here and they come back, you're all going to get killed. And so anyway, after a while, this guy would be standing at the end of the bathtub with his arms crossed across his chest like this. My personal bodyguard, who no one had appointed, he just decided that who was going to be. And every now and again, we might speak to one another, but the music was super loud, so you couldn't really hear anything. And after about 6 months of this being protected by this guy called Paul, he said to me, Rose, I need to tell you something. I am your brother. And I thought it was a metaphor when I was going, oh, that's so nice that you think of me like that. I'm really touched. And he went, no, I'm telling you, I'm your brother. And then he'd been supervising me for 6 months every Saturday night.
Yeah.
And he was my brother.
Amazing. And that wasn't the only occasion either that's happened in your life, was it?
No.
And actually, on family relations, it wasn't the first time, your marriage wasn't the first time you'd been proposed to either.
No, this is a corny old chestnut, but I'll tell you it. Anyway, so I was in New York, and I was during the period of that painting when I was a teenager. So I was a teenager, and I went to New York on my own, and one way or another, I ended up going to lunch at Andy Warhol factory, and there were loads of people there, and it was glamorous, and Andy Warhol asked me if I wanted to go to Studio 54, and as I was 18 and you can't get into a club or a bar or anywhere without ID, he took me to Studio 54 and said to the bouncer, "Oh, this is my friend from London, and she's going to be coming here whenever, let her in whenever," and all this. And I was thinking, oh, this is good. And then at the lunch thing with Andy Warhol, he asked me to marry him, not in a way that you have to have any fear that anything might be going to happen sexually or anything. It was just some sort of a thing, a show of his appreciation, maybe, of my teenage punkdom. And so he drew a wedding ring with his initials on it on my finger. And then later on that day, I went to the top of the World Trade Center in the lift, and there was a Polaroid photo booth there. And I had myself photographed like this with my Andy Warhol wedding ring. And that is what's on the cover of the book.
Yeah. It's an incredible photograph, isn't it? How long did you leave it on for?
I can't remember. I probably was slightly careful for 2 days, and then I
really need to wash my hands.
Yeah. I can't remember.
Yeah. You said before about about rereading those diaries and what you remembered versus what you saw in the book. I wondered really, as we sort of draw to a conclusion with the conversation, how did this process change your relationship with your dad, and how did it change your relationship with the past, and how was that process for you? I wonder whether or not it was, I don't know, a very helpful thing for you to have written as well. Yes,
very helpful, and I learned a lot about myself that I didn't know before, and now I know it. I'm more comfortable, and I'm sort of easier to self-soothe than I was before, and I think that's because I haven't got a lot of stuff that's sort of simmering away underneath. And I think having thoroughly investigated every single thing I ever thought and felt has been strangely a healing process for me. And I, for example, in relation to my mum, I didn't ever think I was cruel to my mum when I was being a nightmare. And I just felt, well, it's all your fault. You shouldn't have brought me up like this or something. And then when looking back, I can see that my attitude towards my mum was quite cruel sometimes. And I didn't know that about myself. I felt really innocent in relation to that relationship. And then I think it really did me good to see in my diary thinking, just not having enough compassion. And I think having finished the book, I felt very compassionate towards my dad, felt very compassionate towards my mum, and also towards myself. And I think, yes, it's been very unexpectedly healing, and I'm glad that I'm on the other side of it. But it feels, it's not that it feels that I can smile about it rather than just feel traumatized. So that's quite a result. Shall I read that other bit?
Yeah. We'll finish with the last reading.
Okay. At the Cromwell Hospital for a blood test, an inept nurse laid him out on a high trolley and, trying to find a vein, stabbed him over and over again in his left arm until he was shouting in pain. The nurse wanted to have a go at the other arm, but I asked her to stop and find someone more experienced. She went to get help, leaving us alone for a few minutes under the bright lights, my father closing his eyes in exhausted resignation, too done in even to get up and walk out in disgust, both of us knowing the ordeal was not over. I wanted to take his hand, but was too shy. I took his bony old foot instead and held on to it while a phlebotomist in a white coat entered the room and found a vein without inflicting any more pain. Afterwards, back home in bed, my father told me he felt like he was trying to hold open the lid of his coffin with one hand. After a light lunch at Clark's the following Saturday, Dad climbed slowly to the top of his house for his afternoon rest, and I followed, glad to keep him company, glad to get some rest myself in the peace of his bedroom. I renewed his morphine patch. He divested himself of his trousers for comfort and lay down in bed, still wearing his shirt and the scarf he rarely took off, head propped up on a couple of pillows, and his diminished body almost flat under the covers. I was reading Middlemarch to him. We were about halfway through the first chapter, my chair between the bed and the window, the book angled to catch the afternoon light coming through the top leaves of the trees in his back garden. The trees had grown tall and thin, reaching up for the white sky to stay alive, and diagonally behind me, in the shadow the other side of the fireplace, the Bacon painting, Two Figures, 1953, took up nearly the entire wall, the grappling men ceaselessly grappling, while my father rested under the fawn blankets and the white metalasse bedspread edged with white cotton lace. I like to read aloud, but remember on that occasion I was careful to enunciate every word to the best of my ability because I lacked complete confidence in my voice, the shape of my vowels in particular, my mother having taught me to say how, now, brown, cow, to correct my accent, but undermining me unintentionally with her edicts against the way some people pronounced or even just employed certain words and phrases. She really minded any contravention of her mysterious system, was helplessly pained if we said either with a long E, although she had discarded nearly all the other social niceties or otherwise of her own upbringing. I had picked up the fat paperback of Middlemarch from a pile on the floor and begun from the beginning the previous day, pretty sure my father had not read it before, wondering whether an excursion into a world so far from his own might take his mind off his illness. He listened intently, and I took a breath after a few pages. He was still wide awake, agitating slightly under the certainty of the authorial voice, not lulled by it as I'd hoped. I asked him what he thought of the book, and he said what struck him most about Middlemarch was George Eliot's extraordinary method, the woman telling the reader exactly what to think and feel about each of her characters. It was clear to me he was not prepared to take her word for anything and wanted to make up his own mind. The next day I dipped into Man with a Blue Scarf, a book by Martin Gayford about sitting, and read out a long passage, the author quoting my father, holding forth about art. Dad began to smile and nod his head in delight, not realizing he was listening to himself. "I couldn't agree more," he said.
Thank you, Rose Boyt.
Thank you.
Copies of Naked Portrait, although not yet published, are in the bar that you walked in through. So should you wish to purchase a copy, Rose will kindly sign some copies if you'd like them signed. My name's Matthew Shaw. I'll be hosting this evening. And after a short interval, I shall be back with Eliza Clark. So refresh your glasses. See you soon.